There we go. So we're live. Awesome. Hey, everybody. Welcome to today's live event. My name is Margaret Pinard, and you are on BookTube. And it's a very exciting place to be this month because we've got a special readathon, March of the Moderns. You may have heard of it. I'm a little dressed up, but not too dressed up. And we've got a lot of stuff going on. We've got buddy reads. We've got special guests like today. And so I'll be putting some information up to let you know what we have. But for the moment, I'm just going to introduce my guest, Camille Di Maio, historical fiction writer with 5 books to her credit and diverse awards. She currently lives in Virginia with her husband and 4 children, and she's graciously agreed to come on and talk to us about the modern era. I just wanted to ask, are you at work on book 6 just like I am?
I just turned in book 6, so I'm working on book 7. I'll still have to do for 6, but I got to the end last week, so I'm diving back into book 7 now.
Awesome. So I'm inviting you on for March of the Moderns because I read your book that was released last year, The First Emma, and that took place in the modern period, and actually 2 moments in the modern period, so it was extra special. But what periods are you drawn to normally, and what makes them so compelling for you?
Well, I grew up reading from a much older era than what I write. I love like Jane Eyre and the British classics like that, but I enjoy writing in, it seems old to me, but I guess if you're writing Victorian, the modern era would be the 20th century. So I really like writing in that mid 1930s to 1950s is what I enjoy writing a whole lot. It kind of found me more than I found it, just because the nature of what I was doing with my first book made sense to set it during World War II. And so I set about doing research, and I fell in love with the research process, and I fell in love with that era. And so now into book 7 doing the same thing.
Wow, cool. Okay, so you've had a few sort of like side tangents like this one where you have either a dual timeline or you've gone a little bit later or earlier.
Yeah, most of my books have some kind of dual narrative component to it. Usually I've had a few where it's a little bit slightly more of a modern time period. I had that in my second book, and then others where there's maybe 30 years difference. But I love connecting 2 periods through dual time period because it shows that even though the details have changed over time, it shows we're all really the same. We have dreams and we have hopes and disappointments and loves. And I feel like when you bring 2 time periods into a story, you actually connect humanity that way.
Like balm to my soul. I love it. I mean, it sounds very similar. I think I'm probably like pointing a finger more than basking in the warmth of humanity, because I feel like I'm shaking someone by the collar in my historical fiction. But that I like the positive side as well. So I just wanted to say, if you have questions for the modern period, if you're joining in any of our buddy reads and you happen to be on at the moment, feel free to write your questions in the comments, and we will ask them after I get to ask my questions because I'm the interviewer. That's my privilege. So 2 timelines. First, the 19-teens and then the 1940s, and both in the US. So my first question was that I am currently researching Germans in 1890s Chicago and how wrapped up they are in socialism and all the different labor movements, and it's fascinating. So this was a big component. The German-American identity was a big component of The First Emma, and I'm wondering how much was the concept of American identity questioned during the 2 periods you examined, and how did that jump out at you?
Well, especially in the 19-teens, as you were saying, and I will say The First Emma is inspired by a true story. So it's my first of my 5 published books that is about a real life woman. So there were some constraints as to what was her experience that went into the book and what might have been happening on a wider scale. If it wasn't part of her experience, it didn't make it into the book. But she was married to a German immigrant. She was of German descent, and as we were getting into the different wars, especially into World War II, they were certainly seeing a lot of German American discrimination. And so I touch on that in the book, and some of the, even I didn't know even before writing this that there were camps for German Americans, just like there were for Japanese Americans and so forth. There's just a lot of suspicion. And yet her family especially had been in for several generations. They'd started successful businesses. They were all in with being Americans, but ended up having that trouble and that discrimination. So it touched on her life. I wouldn't say it was all encompassing, so I didn't go deeply down that hole, but I did comment on it.
Very good. Yeah, rabbit holes. We know about rabbit holes here.
We do. Info dumps. I could totally info dump. But I will say, I write what I call it historical fiction light, because I have a lot of people who don't read the genre tell me that they love my books. And I think it's because I don't dive too deeply, if that makes sense. So people who like historical get just enough historical meat. I feel like I provide that, but the contemporary reader finds that they're not getting inundated either. So that's why I don't dive deep into the bigger global scales, what was happening in a particular sector. It kind of bring it into what was happening in a character's life.
Did you have to fiddle a lot with the structure? Because when you say that, and that you're not putting much of the like meat so that it doesn't get too bogged down, the structure has like these newspaper snippets at the beginning to sort of separate the chapters. Did that come like first thing, like that's how you're going to do it, or was that something that you had to like think through for a while?
That was a light bulb moment at Panera Bread. If y'all have ever read Chanel Cleaton, who wrote Next Year in Havana, and as she's gone on to write a lot of other wonderful historics, we happened to be together at Panera Bread one time. She was working on her current book, which is about to come out, The Most Beautiful Woman in Cuba. I was working on the first Emma. We're griping about writer complaints and all that kind of stuff. And my issue with this book is that there's 3 Emmas in it, as you recall. And again, this is a true story. So there was Emma Kaler, whose husband she was injured in a car accident and in a wheelchair. And her husband, who was a big brewing tycoon, had affairs with her 2 nurses, both of whom were also named Emma. Then one of the Emma mistresses murdered him. And so you have these 3 Emmas, but it was the Emma wife whose story I wanted to tell. And yet my dilemma was the murder trial was pretty interesting too, but I didn't want to spread it too thin when I'm trying to narrow and tell her story. So this was my dilemma at Panera, is how do I tell the story of this trial without taking focus from what I really wanted to illuminate about Emma? And then it dawned on me, there surely were newspaper clippings, because it was considered the trial of the century at the time. And when I found enough of those to spread that throughout, it was like, thank you, God. It's like 90% perspiration, 10% inspiration. That was an inspiration moment. So I loved that. Those are real newspaper clippings, and it allows the reader to follow the trial without losing the storyline of Emma that I wanted to tell.
Yeah, you've got them. They're sort of like put apart so that it looks like a little clipping, or
they're real. Cool. And we were just shy of copyright. I found out that they were just old enough to not have to go chase that. Oh. I was so relieved to find that out. Yeah.
Nicely done. Yeah, it's one of those ripped from the headlines that it's stranger than fiction. Yeah. But when I first heard about this, I think I heard about you first in a Zoom with Chanel and Elise Hooper and a couple of other ladies, and it was great, and it was such a great conversation. But I remember hearing this premise for the first time, and then visiting my hometown and walking by a certain building that was by the railroad and going, that's totally the brewing building she's talking about, like just having envisioned it so clearly. It was really funny.
Is San Antonio your hometown?
Sorry?
Is San Antonio your hometown?
No. It's a place called San Luis Obispo, California.
Oh,
so
okay.
It's not the actual place. It's just like about the same time period. It was giving me the same vibe.
Yeah.
So.
Well, that's where I got the idea for the book. I'm a native of San Antonio, although I live in Virginia now. And I grew up in Denver. As you saw my bio, I've been all over the place. But we would go to San Antonio every year, and there was a big old not quite dilapidated, but definitely abandoned building. And I knew it had been a brewery once upon a time, and it was beautiful. But about 6 or 7 years ago, it was recreated into a gorgeous hotel that Condé Nast called one of the best new hotels in the world. And it was called Hotel Emma. And that made me go, who is Emma that gets a place like that named after her? So, and then I found her story and said, oh my gosh, that needs to be a book.
Yeah. That sounds like a good place to visit if anyone is, stopping over in Texas.
Yes, definitely.
Let's see. So one of the other issues I talked about, besides ethnic identity that came up in your books, was gender. And so there was a particularly compelling scene in Walgreens that I pointed out that I wanted to talk to you about. There's a Walgreens epiphany. And yes. I wanted to ask you more about women and the male gaze and sort of how you envision women of this period coming to the realization of like, wait, what about from where I'm standing instead of how the men see me, kind of thing.
It was like that. And it really was just kind of, I think I stumbled onto an ad. My character was going to go into a Walgreens. She had a little extra pocket money for once. She was going to buy herself a lipstick. And here she is, she's working. This is a fictional character that I wove into the real life story. So my fictional character is working for this real life woman, Emma, who is at the end of her life and wants her memoirs written. And she's just so impressed by what Emma did in her life at a time when, few women were owning businesses back in the 19-teens. So it's kind of shifting her perspective as she's trying to find her place in this new World War II world that she's in. And when she goes into Walgreens to buy this lipstick, it was a true thing. All these ads I found where every ad for a cosmetic was geared around how much he is going to like it. He's going to love your lips this way, wear the blush that he, every single ad I kept finding was geared toward that. And I don't even have a problem with that. It's just that it was shocking to me because that's not how we advertise now. And I think that was those 1940s, I think things were shifting with a lot of men off to war. And it just kind of dawned on me like, well, I like to wear lipstick because I just like to wear it. And I was just kind of surprised to find that all the advertising went that way. So I wove that into the storyline.
Yeah. Nice. That was really good. It was a great moment. It's one of like my turn the corner of the page down moments. And where
and there were so many more I could have included. I only ever meant to I just wanted to find like what kind of lipstick would she have bought. And it was a rabbit hole. I'm like, oh my gosh. So I think I had her mentioning maybe 6 that she found, but actually there was a lot that I kept finding. I had to narrow them down.
Very cool. Very cool. All right, one of the other questions I had for you. We have the impression of both the U.S. and the U.K. So also my historical fiction's mostly in the U.K. I'm only just starting my first book in the U.S. in Chicago. So the U.K. and Scotland are more of my specialties. Pulling together for the war effort in the 1940s, and your protagonist, Mabel, considers limiting gas consumption as a duty, something she needs to do for the good of all. Do you have other books from this area that served as examples of this way of thinking? And how do you relate that to how we don't seem to think that way anymore? And it's more about my own household and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, it was definitely an era. You could just look at any number of war posters and absolutely everything is about working together for that common cause, buy war bonds or, if you save on bread, you're actually giving him bread, fighting overseas for you. Even like the book I just turned in, my character is engraving ordnance for this warship. And even the little metal shavings that fall get collected so that they can melt them down and reuse them again. So just nothing is wasted. People are growing victory gardens. I just find that so interesting. My first exposure to that was writing my first book, The Memory of Us, which does take place in England. And it was not that I didn't know it before, but I think just doing the research really fully immersed me in the sacrifices needed from the everyday person for what, and allowed that. And so in contrast to kind of a what's in it for me culture, like you're mentioning, I think that there is a big contrast. Although I will say, I think that there's a little shift to that right now. I'm just falling in love with the movement I've seen towards buy local, buy small. I think we're kind of shifting back into thinking in a more outward way. So these things go back and forth. I think we're exiting, I think, a fairly selfish era. And I think and hope, maybe that's the Pollyanna in me, but I hope and see a lot of ways we're shifting back outward.
From your lips, right? Yeah, that would be good.
Yeah,
that would be good, because there's a lot of things that could only be solved together, and so there's really no way to get it done.
And this year, I think that this year was pivotal. Obviously, a lot of horrible things happened in 2020, and I'm not dismissing that, but I do like to see the good in things, and I think that there was such generosity in it. And at least in my family, we were so conscious about keeping the small businesses alive, restaurants specifically, and we always liked supporting that. But I think 2020, as much as there was an inward focus, I think a lot of people had an outward focus. How do we save these businesses? Let me do pickup, curbside. How do we shift and save our community through this time? So I want to think it's heading in a good direction.
Mm. Yeah.
Okay, my nickname is Pollyanna in the household. So
I'm in a sort of weird position. It's hard for me to gauge what the efforts have been, because I've just been so removed and so quarantining myself, because I don't know if my sister and I were just talking about this last night. There's a TikTok meme that says the next people in the vaccine rollout are the ones who had hairstyles like this, and then they show like a bunch of 1980s school pictures. And it's one of those, like, yes, I know I'm in the last rollout group ever, because I'm like in the middle age group and like totally healthy and not in any employment group that's essential. And so it's just like, I'm just going to be in my house quarantining alone forever. So I don't get to see a lot of the volunteer stuff, because I figure I'm just putting myself and others at risk if I go out. So I'm just, the ship is sailing on forward, I guess.
It probably depends on your community too. It's something that I did notice here, but we live in a small town where, if even one business closed, it would be very noticed. So I think there was a pretty big push to shift toward, curbside and takeout, and until things did open up. But just even neighbors helping neighbors, texting, hey, I'm going to the grocery store, do you want me to get stuff for you? I just felt like I saw a rise of that as well. So any crisis is going to bring out our worst and our best, and I like to celebrate the best.
There you go. All right. Yeah, the Victory Garden thing is nice. I wish I had a garden to grow food in, but we're seeing about that in the new year. So that is a thought. What about the women in business angle? So you mentioned the first Emma, the one who grew up in the teens, was the brewery, I won't say like mastermind, but basically, yeah. So I've lost my place here. I was thinking about women in business and the strong positions they have and the characters you were writing. And so for the first Emma, this was something that raised her up. But for Mabel, the fictional character that you used to draw out that story, she is in a much less powerful position. And it's funny because the alcohol, the beer that's raised up the first Emma, has sort of brought the Mabel character down because of alcoholism in her family and destitution. So what would you say about the attitudes to alcohol and the differences in those two eras and in different classes? Because they obviously come from different classes as well.
Sure. Well, as far as the women in business part of it, the true story with Emma Kaler is that when her husband, who was the brewing tycoon, was murdered, she took over the business. And that's a bit of a simplified way of saying it, but essentially that she did. And this was 1914 that he died. And so for a woman to take this over was quite an exceptional thing at the time. And it was big. It was a very big brewery. And then they moved into Prohibition. And so now your whole industry has suddenly been destroyed by prohibition. And she pivoted, as much as we've had to this past year. Speaking of pivoting, she pivoted and used all of her facilities to turn them into ice cream, auto repair, everything. And she didn't lose one employee. All the while she was campaigning to, repeal prohibition at the same time. And then when she saw the signs that that was going to go away, she got everything back into production. And at midnight, she had 100 trucks rolling out with beer again. So she was the only large brewery in the South to not go out of business in Prohibition. And so for a woman to have done that at that time was just particularly extraordinary. So later on, I have my character Mabel in World War II era, who is hired to write Emma's memoirs. And I love the shifting that happens for women in the 1940s. So the men, so many of them go off to war, and the women have to take their places. And it's the first time that women are in mass getting an opportunity to do things that had not been so traditional before. And so Mabel is swept up in that. So here she is taking these memoirs down of this woman who did something extraordinary decades before any women were doing it. And she's in this turning point of history where she's straddling both things. She can go this very traditional way, or she can start exploring her other gifts. And I think it puts her in a really neat position to start emboldening her in this new opportunity to take that opportunity.
Yay.
That was the business part. Okay, you asked me about Prohibition too. One thing, and again, it's historical fiction light, so I didn't do like paragraphs and paragraphs about the politics of Prohibition, but it was very interesting to me to find out that you were labeled wet or dry. It was like during that era,
yeah.
I had no idea that it was so like you were just labeled, are you wet or are you dry?
Yeah.
It was a very, very divisive thing. And I don't think I quite realized that so much until I wrote this book.
Yeah.
So making Mabel the daughter of an alcoholic who becomes a personal teetotaler, at least, writing the memoirs of a woman who owns this huge brewery, just put a little more skin in the game for her.
Got it. Yeah, I love the like internal conflict at the beginning where she's wondering, can I put my preference out there that this is not something I do and be authentic and still maintain this job that I just, came thousands of miles from?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we're all faced with moral dilemmas like that sometimes. So she had to try to navigate that, opportunity versus honesty. And, I like exploring those challenges.
Yeah. It's really, really cool. The job search thing, coming thousands of miles for a job based on a newspaper announcement. It's kind of like, meeting someone not in a public space after responding to them on Craigslist. It's a little sketchy. So was that how it was seen in that time period? Or what was your take on the social trust level in this era? Because we've already talked about suspecting German Americans, and now we have someone who's maybe naive and not the average sort of level of trust, but she's just so desperate that it works. Yeah.
And that's the word. I had to bring her to a point of desperation that kind of all caution was thrown to the wind. And so the setup in the beginning of the book is that this character works in Baltimore. She's from Baltimore, hasn't really left it, but her mother died years ago of cancer. Her father is an alcoholic who leaves for such long periods of time. She doesn't even know if he's alive or dead. One of her brothers has died in the war, and the other brother is MIA. And she's holding down this job as a secretary, which is great because it means she doesn't have to work in a dangerous munitions factory. But then her boss makes a pass at her and she runs out of that situation, and she just has nothing. Now she doesn't have a job, a family, or anything. And she comes across this ad offering to take, and it's also just a rainy and snowy day, and she slips on the ice and she scrapes her knee. It's just like, I'm done. So I had to get her to such a place of desperation that it didn't seem entirely crazy to respond to a newspaper ad across the country. And yet, like, how else could that have been advertised? If we didn't have internet ads, and we couldn't go research anybody to see if this was legit. For the job that Emma wanted this person to do, it would have made sense to put advertisements in the classifieds. I mean, I looked for jobs. I'm not that old, but I mean, I was looking for my first jobs in the classifieds, not across the country necessarily, but it's what they had. So I don't think today we'd think it was crazy. Back then, I don't think it was so unusual, and she was desperate. So yeah, it is. I have to throw out a caveat right there, though. I think it is so interesting when we have a modern reader. I get a couple of little comments, especially in The Memory of Us. There's something that my character does where if you did it today, people would be up in arms. But back then, it made total sense. And I get a couple of comments once in a while in my reviews where people go, that's just awful that she did that. I'm like, that's exactly what she would have done in 1938. We can't really judge it based on our lenses today, and kind of same with what Mabel does by taking this job.
Yeah, and that must have been an exciting train ride. I mean, it's hard to balance like getting across the tedium and the worry and the sort of suspended state that you would be in such a transitional journey, but you do it very well. So there's echoes. So what did I read recently like a kid's book version of the train journey that Robert Louis Stevenson took across the U.S. in the 1890s to get to his sweetheart in California.
Oh, yeah.
Because I was looking for period detail for 1890s and transportation and what would have been available and stuff. And kid's book, hey, if it's accurate, I'm fine with it.
Well, yeah, I love it. I mean, as you've seen in my bio, I've traveled all over the world. I am a travel addict. I absolutely love it. And yet it had involved very little train travel. I mean, the prior 16 years before living in Virginia, I did live in San Antonio. So train travel, you didn't travel anywhere by train there. Then I moved to Southern Virginia, and I have a train line 5 minutes from my house that can take me all the way to Boston without transferring if I wanted to. I've done it once. I'm not doing it again because it's like 15 hours. But I frequently go to New York City, which is about 8 hours. And the first time I got on this Amtrak and these cities are passing me by in these towns, I was just awestruck. And this is after having done so much travel, but I'm just the simplicity of sitting by a train window and rivers and lakes that I didn't even know existed are passing me by, and I'm seeing the little houses on them. And then we, pass through Philadelphia, and I've been to Philadelphia, but there's things I haven't seen that I've seen from the train tracks. And we go through DC, and I've been to DC, but I'm like, there's the Washington Monument. So these are things I've seen, and I'm still like, wow, seeing them from a train window. So I had to imagine that Mabel, never having left the Baltimore area, sitting at a train window, and let alone she's given a sitting in first class, it had to be like, wow. So I'm sure there were tedious moments, but I kind of emphasize the wow moments because I think that's how I feel about it when I'm on a train.
Nice. It is magical, and I wish we had more of that. I mean, it may not be suited to certain parts of America, but I used to live in DC, and I would go up and down, sometimes on buses, sometimes on trains. And I've been up and down California once or twice on the train. And it's just so, it's so inefficient. It's magical. It can be magical. But like over long distances, when you have one train a day going through town and you have to get there at like 1 a.m., it's not made for passengers. Like
it's not convenient. It's not efficient. But if I flew to New York, we figured out you only save 2 hours by flying, because by the time I travel to the airport, you get there super early, and then I fly into Newark, and there's the travel time there, then the Newark into New York. I'm really only saving about 2 hours. But in the meantime, I just get right on the train. I bring a book. And the very, very best thing I've discovered is writing on a train. So I can knock out, one time traveling to New York, I knocked out 6,000 words, which for me is a super, super, super big day. It takes me a long time to write 6,000 words, but in one train trip I did. It was for a book event, and I ended up sitting next to this author, another author at this event, and I'm mentioning like, oh my gosh, I wrote 6,000 words in one day on the train. And I forgot what specialty she is, but she had a medical background with specialty in the brain. And she said that it has been proven that train travel is literally the very best and most productive place to write. And it's because the gentle rocking movements are connecting your left and your right brain. And so the logical and the creative are coming together. So you just problem solve plot issues in a way that just make you want to tear your hair out when you're sitting still. She said, likewise, walking does the same thing. But the problem with walking is you don't have your laptop right in front of you. So when you sit there on the train and this little motion is happening, it's like, whoa. So
that's so cool.
It's not an efficient thing, but I just think it is glorious. As a reader and a writer, I could just live on a train.
I mean, you've heard about the Amtrak retreats, right? You've heard about the writing retreat that Amtrak did, I don't know, like 8 years ago or so.
I didn't research it, but I've heard a mention of that.
Yeah. It was a big thing for a couple of years, and then I know at least one person did it and published something, and then I just sort of didn't hear about it anymore. So I don't know if they're still doing it, but it was such a great idea.
I would totally do that.
Woo! Writer dream.
Yes.
Yeah, very cool. What other themes do we have for the modern period that we want to hit on? Oh, I know. So the other thing that was in your bio was about theater, Broadway singing, and I thought this is really cool. You give us a little peek into 1940s theater history with the under the radar wrong title for Oklahoma before we know it's actually Oklahoma.
Yes.
So what sort of things did you consult for that, and what's your background or interest in the theater world of the period?
Oh, I was such a theater nerd in junior high and high school. I was a perpetual chorus girl. I was good enough to make chorus, not nearly good enough to make a big role. The biggest role I ever had was Patty Simcox in Grease playing the cheerleader, which is not a terribly big role. And, I was really okay with that. It was always most important to me that the show was as great as it could be. And if I wasn't going to be the best one, I didn't want to have the best role. I wanted it to be as great as it was. And so I did quite a lot of shows through all of that. And I had big starry dreams of being on Broadway someday. I don't know why I thought I could make it, since I was always that chorus girl. But the thing that really kind of killed that dream for me is in maybe my junior year of high school, I auditioned for a show in which for the first time I was the best for the role. And I was auditioning with a friend of mine for a show called Do Black Patent Leather Shoes Really Reflect Up? And we did this scene and I cried on cue, which I completely can't do, but I got into it. And even the other people auditioning gave us a standing ovation. So that tells you we were in. And then neither of us even made the show, let alone those roles. We didn't make the show at all. And based on who did get the roles, it became very apparent that it was totally a favorites thing. And I was determined after that, I am not going to get into a career that is subjective. And then I became a writer. Okay, I was a realtor before I was a writer. That wasn't too subjective, but I became a writer, which is completely subjective. So I don't think I realized that until I got into it. But to go to your question, I was just such a theater nerd. I auditioned with the song Oklahoma one time for some show I was doing. I had to belt it out, and I did Oklahoma, and it became a long-standing family joke because I just spent so much time belting out Oklahoma. And so when I was researching for Emma, because this park next to Emma Kaler's real house has a real theater. They just changed the name a couple of years ago, but I've seen some shows there. It's a great little regional theater, very well thought of. And I wanted her to see something there. And I go back and research plays or musicals of the era. And there was that one that had been the play that later inspired Oklahoma. So kind of as a nod to the family
Easter egg.
Family Easter egg. My mom especially loves to go through things. She's like, I know why you put that in there. So I've always got something. And so it was Oklahoma. There's a very hidden Easter egg because it was actually the play, which I don't have it. I'm kind of forgetting the name of it. Was it How Green Was My Valley? Or no, it wasn't that. Something like that.
Throw the rushes or something like that.
Yeah, I know the word green and lilies or something is in. I did it like a year and a half ago. I don't remember. But yeah, that was my little nod to my theater nerdiness, is that's the play that she goes to see.
We love it. We love it. There's not enough theater in books. I feel like most historical fiction writers are closet theater nerds. I mean, this is a common path, I believe. So there should definitely be.
I pitched to my agent one time. I had an idea for set in the 1940s, a book that would take place in the Broadway theater, because I have seen a lot of shows there. I mean, I just absolutely love it, and have done a fair amount of history, and I would have research, and I would have loved to put it into a book. And my agent said it was too limited, and that nobody would want to, no publishers would want to buy a historical fiction book about theater. And I thought, what?
What?
So, yeah. So I pitched
and came out.
I know. So I only really, it was just a pitch. I didn't go very far into it, thankfully. But she's a very, very good agent, and I do listen to her. So maybe it's something down the road I'll write. And if she continues to hold that opinion, maybe I'll self-publish it or something like that. But I would love to explore that. I think it's just theater people, I have to say, are just the best people in the world.
Yes.
Best people. I was such a little nerd, and theater people didn't care. And I wasn't just a theater nerd. I was like a nerd, library nerd. And my own kid, like the kids in school, I sat by myself at the cafeteria and all that kind of stuff. But in the theater, I was just one of everybody, and such an embrace. So I would love to write a book that just kind of celebrates the beauty I've experienced in it.
What about sources? Because actually there's a piece of family history for me that is related to theater history, not on the stage, but behind the stage for New York. And I've tried searching the company that was putting on shows that my family was involved in working for. And it's very hard to find information on that era. And so, like, what did you do where did you go for those resources?
Well, I didn't go for the first Emma. It's really there's not too deep. It's more like a scene and a little bit of a reference. I do have a scene that takes place in another theater called the Majestic. It's the scene where they've got the cloud machine going, and that's a real theater. That's a real theater.
That was super cool.
I think it continues to be the most beautiful theater I've ever seen. So y'all can look it up, the Majestic in San Antonio. So I could not write a book set in San Antonio and not give a good nod to the Majestic. But because this other book was really just a pitch to my agent, I did not go deep into it. So I really research as I go. I get the nugget of an idea, and then I go with it. So I kind of consider myself, when I'm researching, I'm like a colander. So the information pours in and everything pours out except what I need. I do not you can ask my husband, I don't retain information very well. So I really just read what I need to, I take out what I need to, and the rest just kind of falls away. So if I ever sat down to write a real theater book, I would truly get into the research. Other historical fiction authors, and maybe you're the same, do this. Like, I was at a talk one time with Michelle Gable, who writes historical fiction. And she said in her talk that prior to reading The Summer I Met Jack, was her book, which is about Jack Kennedy, she read 200 books about Jack Kennedy and the Kennedy family before even beginning to write this book. And I went, not my method.
Wow.
Not my method.
Yeah.
So hats off to her. But no, I will write and just pull in what I need to make the story interesting and authentic, and then I move on.
Yeah. Wow.
I think that's why I want to write a theater book, because I kind of want to do the research.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. I think I'm closer to you. I read a handful of books beforehand, and then I try to get what the story is, because I never know the ending until the ending is here.
Exactly. Classic pantser.
Yeah. And then I go back, like, where I am right now on my current book is trying to fill in the something happens here because I don't have the research for this, and like filling in those brackets, or what was the quote, or what was the speech, or who was the person who was there, kind of thing. Yes. And there's some fascinating things. I'm learning a lot about Hull House in Chicago, and like I said, the labor agitators, and like the anti-sweatshop bill and all that kind of stuff. It's like, it's so juicy.
Oh yeah. Well, then our danger, as you know, is to info dump. And that's what every editor and agent is trying to keep you from, is don't info dump, because we geek out on all these things that we could put in the book. And we really have to restrain ourselves to make it really authentic to the character and the story, and not just say, look at all these geeky details I found.
Yeah. Well, the colander metaphor is interesting, because like you said, books that you wrote a year, 2, 3 years ago, it's kind of like they're in notebooks, like all those notes they sort of fell away, you know? It's like Tony Stark in his Iron Man suit. It just sort of goes away and now like never comes back except maybe in a weird dream 3 years later, you know?
Well, and I don't reread my books. I now understand when you see actors who are out you know, promoting a movie that they're in, quite a lot of them will say that they haven't actually watched the movie. Yeah. And I didn't understand that until I became a writer. I don't go back and I don't read my books. And the reason is because I would keep editing them in my head. I would get to something, I'm like, why did I do that?
Oh, no.
I would do it. And I don't want to put myself through that. The other reason is when I'm writing, I'm hyper focused on that story. And so that's why I told you at the beginning of this off camera that it can be, I have to really refamiliarize myself with one of my books when I come and talk about them, because by the time you get to the end, and then it's in the publisher's hand, and then the time span before it's published is such a long time that you're working on something else. And I have to go, oh yeah, well, I have to answer that question. And I did a live radio broadcast one time for my second book, and it had been so long since I did anything to read or study up on this book because I was immersed in my third book. And he asked me a question that caught me off guard, and I simply did not remember. It made me feel really stupid on this radio interview that I didn't remember this detail, but all of the, you know, he had just read it, so it was super fresh in his mind. I'm like, I haven't read it in a year and a half. I probably should refamiliarize myself with my books before launch.
Yeah, that's tough. Yeah, that's funny. I watch chat shows. Sometimes I'll watch Graham Norton, especially. He's like my favorite funny comedian chat show. And yeah, actors do say that. And I had never connected that to authors. But yeah, I mean, why would you read your own book after it's out? You're like on to the next thing. So
yeah.
Oh,
that's me.
What did I have about servants? Okay, so here's a question. I think one of my last questions about class in Texas in the 1940s. You're Emma Kahler. I was saying Kohler in my head, so I'll correct it to the German pronunciation.
I heard it both ways, and she had no descendants, and so it's a little bit lost. And I've heard it both ways from fairly semi-official people. So you can say whatever you want. You might be right.
Okay. She has servants in her house, sort of like a staff, a cook, a housekeeper, and cleaning staff. So what does that say about her approach? Is it more old world? Is it more of a I don't know, class distinction because she's one of the framers of that town? Or how did you think that?
I think it was just more practical than anything. So she and her husband did not have children, and yet I don't know. I could not find any sources to say if that was intentional or not. But given the era, it was probably infertility of some, for some reason or another. So but they had built this gigantic, at the time, I mean, it was one of the biggest houses in San Antonio, and it sat up on a hill, and her husband could look out over the brewery to make sure that the stacks were smoking and the employees were working and so forth. So I think considering it was just the two of them initially in this big house, it made sense to have a staff. And in that era, that wouldn't have been unusual at all. I looked at the census records, and there were, because I think you would add your staff to the census records, and there were actually very few. She did have a cook, and she had a man who lived on the grounds who seemed to do something, but it wasn't overflowing. And yet they were not only some of the richest people in the city, but some of the richest people in the country. So I don't think it would have been unusual to have that help at all. And I got the impression from her that she was the sort who would have been very kind and took good care of them. I didn't put this in the book, but next to her mansion is a big synagogue. And I did find research that she used to open her lawn so that the people from the synagogue on after worship could come and use her lawn to mingle and to socialize. Otto and Emma had a bunch of family members come in through Germany and be able to kind of use their house as a place to stay until they got on their feet and got jobs. So she was a very philanthropic, generous person as far as I could tell. And I think she would have treated what staff she did have very well.
That's nice. There's a trend I see, and I can appreciate, because there's a certain line, and it may be different in the UK than in the US because class relations are different. But the whole thing about you had a domestic staff, and then there started to be advertisements about for the woman without a staff, because it started changing so much. And either there were no women to be had because the factory was so much more appealing than domestic service life with no freedom at all and higher wages. Or, you know, you were supposed to be managing your household with convenience saving technology rather than people. And so that was like the status marker. So there are these changes that the sort of coming over society in these 30 years. And I was just thinking, like, what might be the reason in this time and place, because I know more about like the end of the Victorian era in the UK rather than here in Texas. I very little about Texas. So.
Yeah. And I mean, having been, you know, I'm fourth generation Texan, I would not, as San Antonian specifically, what I know about the history, there was not a big culture where you had lots of house staff and everything there. I mean, it's not as Wild West as people probably imagine it to be, but it is a rugged, hardy place and very independent place. And so it's not Downton Abbey in Texas at all. But it does make sense that, especially when her husband's a workaholic and she gets injured and she's in a wheelchair, it definitely makes sense that she would have had help.
And, you know, 2 extra help who live in a separate cottage across the town.
Yeah, well, yes, 2 nurses living in the 2 mistresses / nurses got their own cottage across town, which also served as a love shack. So that's, yeah.
So crazy. It must be true.
I know. I could not make that up. Or if I did, my agent would probably say, no, nix that. But I'm like, no, it's a true story.
Right. Yeah. No. Well, we love to read historical fiction as much as write it. And so I was hoping you might be able to pass along a few names of people who put out historical fiction for this time period, 1901 to 1945, the March of the Moderns period, who are doing stuff that you love. So can you give us any recommendations?
Sure. I love Susie Orman Schnall. She just came out last year with We Came Here to Shine, which is about the World's Fair. And I just, Susie and I have talked about this. We think we write very similarly with that historical fiction light. Like I said, you just get delightful pieces of history in her books, but you don't get drowned in the research either. So that's her most recent one, We Came Here to Shine, which is being made into a TV series, I believe. So she's busy working on the screenplay instead of writing a book. Fiona Davis has quite a few wonderful ones out. I know she just mentioned a new one. She hasn't released a cover yet or anything. Chanel Cleaton has The Most Beautiful Woman in Cuba that is coming out. I just started reading that. So Chanel, Fiona, Susie, Jane Healy. I love Jane's book. She did Beantown Girls. What was the second one she did? It was so good. It was about the girls who had the donut trucks in World War II. The name's escaping me, but Jane Healy has The Secret Sisters coming out, but look up her name. Jane Healy would be very comparable to me.
And the one I heard Chanel talking about last year was, I think, The Last Train to
Key West. The Last Train to Key West, yeah.
Yes, and that looked really, really interesting in terms of Florida and hurricanes and the 20s. I think it was set in the 1920s. And like,
yes, I think so. And that was so neat. I remember because she was, we were sitting across at Panera and she was talking to me. That was great. And so, yeah, I thought it was so interesting to set the core of the book over 3 days, you know, surrounding before and after and during a hurricane. And since I'm fairly new to the East Coast, hurricanes are fairly new to me. But in the book that I just turned in, this is what I love about historical fiction. I don't even know how I found this little piece of fiction, but of truth, but in 1944 in Long Island in September, there was a Category 1 hurricane that was pretty unusual for that area to get. And my characters were in Brooklyn, so they wouldn't have gotten the brunt of it, but they would have gotten quite a lot. And I just thought, well, I can't have, and my book was, I had a scene set in that time. I'm like, well, if there's a hurricane going on, I need to be sure to include that. I'm not just going to gloss over that. And I thought of Chanel's book, Writing During a Hurricane, and now I've experienced, you know, a little bit of touch of that. So it was pretty neat about, you know, you want to throw bad things onto your characters and make them react in a real life hurricane is certainly a good one. So yeah. Chanel's it's her currently published book, The Last Train to Key West.
Very cool. Very cool. So I saw Bookish. Brian is a Texan here, and I think he might have some questions. Camille is did you say 4th generation San Antonio?
Yes.
Yeah. So we're talking about the first Emma, which is her book released last year about Hotel Emma, if anyone's been to San Antonio, and the story behind that and the brewery and all that stuff during World War I and World War II for a dual timeline historical fiction novel. We've also got Elle, so she's coming by to say hello. And Danny was also by earlier to say hello, so thanks, guys. So if you guys have any questions, I'm just going to be wrapping up with my last couple. I know actually, I don't know what state Virginia is in terms of lockdown, but I don't know if we're doing events yet. But is there a next place where people can find you or look for what you're up to next or what you're working on?
Well, there's no live events, I think, for most people just yet, although Virginia itself is quite open. So I am enjoying indoor dining and all of the rest. We're living quite normally, I think, which is so great. But as far as what's next, so I just turned in a domestic World War II. It takes place in Brooklyn. So much World War II is overseas, but this is nice home front is the word. I said domestic. Home front World War II book. That will be out probably in spring of 2022. And then I'm working on my passion project right now, which is called Come Fly With Me, which is about the early 1960s Pan Am stewardesses. And I spent COVID just being really embraced by a community called World Wings International, which is an association of former Pan Am stewardesses. And so I got to talk to a lot of ladies in their 80s and even early 90s who were stewardesses in that era, telling me fascinating stories. So I am so happy to be diving back into this book because it's I can be very hard on my writing, but it is for me I'm just enjoying it more than anything else I've ever written. And as far as finding me, I'm always active on Instagram and Facebook, and pretty good on YouTube. I just need to be more consistent. So I look forward to visit. I'm very interactive on Instagram. Love that platform. So find me there.
That's a really fun project. I had a great aunt who passed away a couple years ago, and she was a United Airlines stewardess. And she had some great tales that we wrote down and enjoyed. She was very proud of the fact that Eleanor Roosevelt requested her when she went on flights to be.
Oh, that's nice.
And that was really cool.
Yeah. Oh, I learned so many good stories from these ladies.
Yeah. Fun project. Awesome. And your handle, I'll put it in the chat, is Camille Di Maio _author. Is there a secret behind the _? Did someone already have the?
No, I don't think I set it up as a _. I think it just whenever my friend Rochelle tags me, it shows up as a _, but it's just an _.
Really?
Really? Is it different? I don't think I set it up any differently.
Okay, well, I'll put it in as a single, and then we'll see if it works.
We'll see. Try it as a double. You'll find one way or another. If you start just typing Camille Di Maio, I'm the only one that I know of out there, so you'll find out.
There you go. That is handy when you're the only one. Margaret Pinard, I'm the only one except if you head out into Quebec, and then there start to be a few more Pinard.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And then I would just say we've got our next March of the Moderns event this Friday. We're going to be doing a live buddy read discussion for Precious Bane, which is a Mary Webb classic, and we've got a whole bunch of other events, so I'm just going to pop that one up again. The stuff is on my blog, but some of the other books we're reading, I don't know if you've read these, Camille. Precious Bane, Their Eyes Were Watching God, High Wages, Playboy of the Western World, The Enchanted April. That's one I've had on my shelf.
Oh, read that a long time ago.
We've got some Agatha Christie. We've got some E.M. Forster, some Molly.
Agatha Christie is my all-time favorite author. So yeah, you've
really?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. So we got.
I don't write mystery because of Agatha Christie because I would come up so very short that I don't even try.
Can't improve want perfection, right?
I'm just going to enjoy her as a reader and steer very clear of that genre as a writer.
Yeah, cool. Well, you know, always carving a new niche for ourselves. We're allowed to do that. So I'm glad you're here in historical fiction. So yeah, thank you for coming on and helping us launch the March of the Moderns readathon, and just can recommend your book one more time. The First Emma is delightful, dual timeline, 19 teens, 1940s. It's happy in case anyone needs that in these times, and definitely recommend it. So thank you so much, Camille. And we'll sign off and say bye, everybody.
All right, bye. Thank you.